Hey everyone, this is a short lecture that I'm going to try to combine all the readings from last week, the Nagel, the Jackson, and the Lewis. And the reason is because they're all really about the same idea at bottom, which is the question about whether the world or the universe is entirely physical or whether there's some non-physical aspects to it. And this is kind of a question on people's minds in the 20th century because of the massive success of science. And science is completely materialistic, right? It does not talk about souls or spirits or non-physical things of any kind. It just uses physical vocabulary in explaining how the world works. So we have first Nagel asking about what is it like to be a bat. And the reason he's asking about this is because he thinks if you think carefully about the science of the mind, that you'll think consciousness is something that can never be reduced to scientific vocabulary. And what he means is that there's something special about what it's like to be conscious. And this is the thing that he's trying to draw our attention to when he does the thought experiment about being a bat, right? Being a bat is something that we can kind of imagine ourselves doing. We can imagine ourselves flying around and eating bugs and stuff like that, but we can't really figure out what it's like to be the bat. The bat has its own experience, and that's something that is unique to the bat. It's quite subjective. So Nagel thinks that we also have this subjective experience ourselves, and that it's something that science will never explain. Cognitive science, neuroscience, psychology, those things will never explain it. And the reason is that the experience itself is entirely subjective and first person, and the sciences are a third person vocabulary. So you can think of, say, brain imaging, right? People get stuck in a brain scanner, and we take images of their brains while they are listening to music or thinking about words or looking at a picture or imagining something. And what comes out at the end of that process is just an image, a picture that the scanner produces. And that picture is something that everybody can look at. It's objective, so you can show it to other people. It's a document in the physical world, but that document is not the same thing as the experience the person inside the scanner has. They have their own subjective experience, which is not captured by the scientific data. This is the kind of thing that Nagel thinks is going on in general with consciousness. It's something that science can't explain. And so the idea of, as he says, reductionism, the idea that you can reduce people's experiences to scientific facts, is mistaken. Now, Jackson has a very similar point, but it's said in slightly different terms. And with Jackson, we get the thought experiment about Mary. This is sometimes called black and white Mary, or Mary the neuroscientist, because she's supposed to be a scientist who's stuck or trapped in a black and white room for most of her life, and she learns everything there is to know about physics and chemistry and psychology and the brain and color perception and all of that. But she has never seen anything that's not black or white. And so one day you're supposed to imagine she's shown a ripe red apple or something like that. So she experiences the color red for the very first time. Jackson thinks when she does this, she learns a new thing. And the thing that she learns has to be non-physical, because by hypothesis, when she was in the black and white room and she knew everything about physics and so on, she knew all the physical facts, but if she learns something new, then it can't be one of the physical facts. It has to be something non-physical. This is the kind of thing that makes him think the idea of physicalism, the idea that the world is entirely physical, is false, because Mary has to learn something new that's non-physical about the world, and so the world is not entirely physical. There is some non-physical stuff as well. What's the non-physical stuff? It's a kind of material of conscious experience or something like that. There's a special name for it in philosophy, which is quale or qualia, and these qualia are supposed to be little bits of conscious experience that are not physical, but that we see or experience when we are experiencing the world. Now, this is where David Lewis comes in. Lewis is a physicalist. He thinks the world is entirely physical, and that in order to explain what's going on in the Mary the neuroscientist case, we have to think about it a little more carefully. And what Lewis thinks is that there's not some new fact that Mary learns when she experiences red for the first time. Instead, we should think about it more like she gains an ability. And this, when you first encounter it, this can be a very strange point. It's kind of subtle, but the key difference is between a fact and an ability. So remember that Jackson thinks Mary learns a new fact when she sees red for the first time, and Lewis says, no, it's not a fact, she just gains an ability. What's the ability that he's thinking of? It's something like being able to discriminate or classify things by color on sight. So if you think about Mary in the black and white room before she ever sees red, she knows things about color, but what she has to do if she wants to, say, discover the color of something outside of her room, she has to learn first about what that thing is made of, what its physical properties are, and she has to apply her knowledge of physics and chemistry and all of that to make an inference about what the color of the thing is. And once she sees the red object for the first time, then she gains the ability to just bypass all of that application she has to do in the first place, and she can just immediately recognize on sight, okay, this thing is red, this other thing is red, and so on. She doesn't have to use all of her knowledge of physics and chemistry to figure that out. So that's the ability that Mary gains, and Lewis thinks that if we think about her gaining this ability, then we can see that we don't really have to explain what's going on in terms of any special non-physical stuff, any special qualia or anything like that. We can just think of her and the rest of the world as entirely physical, and she just gains new experience. And that's Nagel, Jackson, Lewis. And if you're ever having trouble figuring out what's going on with any of them, just remember that the big idea at stake here is whether the world is entirely physical. And Nagel and Jackson think that if you think about consciousness and conscious experience, that poses a challenge to the idea that the world is entirely physical. And Lewis is trying to defend the idea that the world is wholly physical against Nagel and Jackson.